She looked out at the prairie and saw what every newcomer saw. Nothing. Just grass, running flat and empty to the edge of the sky in every direction for as far as a person could walk in a day. There were 7 mouths in her house and a winter coming, and the land in front of her looked like it had nothing at all to give. And yet, she would feed them, all of them. Through the snow and the lean months and the years when the crop failed, she would put food on that table. Not because the land was generous, but because she had learned its secret. The prairie was not empty, it was a pantry, and she was one of the last people alive who knew how to open it. This is the story of a frontier mother who fed a family of 7 on what the land threw away, and the forgotten skills that made it possible. We are going to call her Hannah. The name is our own, but her hunger was real, and so was every skill that carried her family through it. Everything you are about to hear was known, once, by thousands of women exactly like her, on homesteads across the American plains. They are skills we have very nearly forgotten. She could not afford to. To understand what she was up against, you have to understand the homestead. Her family had come west for the free land, the 160 acres the government promised to anyone who would work it. But free land is not the same as good land. The claim never quite produced enough. Her husband worked the fields and hired out when he could, often gone for days. And so the daily problem, the relentless, every single day problem of feeding 7 people, landed squarely on her. Without a store within reach, without money to spend at it if there had been, she had only what she could grow, what she could gather, and what she could keep. The growing was the easy part. The keeping was everything. So in the spring, while the men watched the fields, Hannah watched the ground. And the prairie that looked so empty began, slowly, to fill with food, for anyone who had learned to see it. There was a wild tuber the settlers called the prairie potato, starchy and filling, that grew in the dry patches if you knew the leaf to look for. The people who had lived on these plains for thousands of years called it timsala, and it was from them, directly or down the long chain of borrowed knowledge, that the settlers learned to dig it and to dry it for the winter. That was the first secret. Much of what Hannah knew, she owed to the people who had been here first. And there was more. The plants that her neighbors trampled as weeds, she gathered by the apronful. Lamb's quarter and purslane and the tender young dandelion, cooked down like spinach, free and full of nourishment that her children badly needed. Down along the creek, there were wild plums and chokecherries, tart enough to pucker your whole face, which she gathered and dried and pounded, seed and all. Wild onions for flavor, sunflowers for their oily seeds. To the eye that could not read it, the prairie was a wasteland. To Hannah, it was a market that charged nothing but the labor of the walk. And she learned its calendar the way a shopkeeper learns his shelves. She knew the chokecherries ripened under the late summer moon, that the greens were tenderest before the heat turned them bitter, and that the prairie potato had to be dug at just the right week, before the plant that marked it withered and left its tuber hidden until the following year. This was not foraging as a hobby. It was working knowledge of a living landscape, carried in one woman's head, and spent every day to keep her children fed. But gathering food was only half the battle, and not even the hard half. Because food gathered in July does a starving family no good in January. The true skill, the one that separated the families who survived from the families who did not, was preservation. It was the art of reaching through 6 months of winter and pulling summer back out. And as the days began to shorten, Hannah went to war against the coming frost. She started with drying, the oldest method there is. She threaded vegetables and slices of fruit onto heavy string and hung them from the rafters near the fire, where the warm air slowly pulled the moisture out of them until they were leathery and light and would not rot. By winter, she would drop them back into water to swell them up again, the same way we soak dried beans today. Strips of meat she salted and hung to dry over the fire until they were hard as wood and would keep for months. Nothing was left to spoil if drying could save it. Then came the cellar, the closest thing the frontier had to a refrigerator. Dug down into the cool, dark earth, it held a winter's worth of life. She packed potatoes and turnips and beets and carrots into barrels and crates lined with straw, where the steady cool kept them firm for months. But the cellar demanded a discipline of its own, and it was a lesson in vigilance. A single spoiled vegetable, left alone, could rot the entire barrel around it. So she checked them, again and again, pulling the bad ones before they could take the good ones down with them. On the prairie, even rot had to be managed. Meat was the hardest thing of all to keep, and here Hannah's skill ran deepest. When they slaughtered, almost nothing was allowed to escape. She rubbed cuts of meat with salt, sometimes with a little sugar, and packed them down into barrels and crocks, the salt drawing the moisture out, leaving nothing for decay to feed on. Other cuts she hung in a little smokehouse over a slow fire of hardwood, the smoke and gentle heat drying the meat and sealing its fat against turning rancid. And for what was left, she reached for the oldest trick of all. She cooked the meat, packed it tight into a crock, and poured melted fat over the top until it hardened into a seal. And that congealed lid of tallow locked the air out so completely that the meat beneath it stayed good for months. She wasted nothing, not one thing. The bones went into broth that fed them for days. The fat was rendered down into lard for cooking and into soap for washing. The organ meats were eaten, not thrown. When the chickens stopped laying in the short, dark days of winter, she did not simply go without eggs. She had put them up in the fall, coating each one in fat and burying them in sawdust, or sinking them in a crock of salted lime water, where they would keep for months until the hens began again. Corn was shelled and ground for mush and johnny cakes, or kept on the cob in the crib. Fruit was boiled down with precious sugar into jam that would last, the sweetness itself doing the preserving. Every scrap, every bone, every drop of fat had a second life and a third. In Hannah's kitchen, the idea of throwing food away was not just wasteful, it was unthinkable. And so the cellar filled. Jar by jar, crock by crock, string by string, a poor patch of dirt that looked like it could feed no one was transformed by her hands into a winter's worth of food. And when the first hard snow finally came and the prairie outside the door turned white and silent and truly empty at last, the door of that cellar closed on potatoes and dried plums and salted pork and buried eggs and pounded berries, on enough to carry 7 people through to spring. They ate plainly that winter, thin soups, dark bread, dried things softened in water. The same handful of foods turned a dozen different ways. It was not a feast, but no one starved. And in the time and a place where starving was a real and present danger, that was not a small thing. That was a triumph. It was the quiet, invisible triumph that frontier women won over and over again, in sod houses and dugouts across 1,000 miles of plains, and almost none of them were ever thanked for it, and almost none of their names were ever written down. Because here is the part that should stop us. Everything Hannah knew, how to find food in empty grass, how to dry it and salt it and cellar it and seal it, how to make a single hog feed a family until spring, how to look at a barren prairie and see a full pantry. Almost all of it we have lost. We have traded it for the grocery store and the refrigerator, and that trade has given us comfort beyond anything she could have dreamed. But it has also made us helpless in a way she never was. She could be dropped onto bare ground with a sack of salt and keep 7 people alive through a winter. Most of us could not last a month. We do not know her real name. There were thousands of her, and the history books remember almost none of them. The mothers who fed the frontier with knowledge in their hands and almost nothing in their cupboards. So this is for her, the woman who looked at an empty prairie and saw a way to keep her children alive. The skills she carried were not magic. They were learned, earned, and very nearly lost forever. If her story moved you, if it made you wonder what your own great-grandmother knew that you do not, then she is not forgotten anymore. Stay with us and we will keep bringing the forgotten back into the light.